Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org. Edina Eye Physicians and Surgeons, a division of Twin Cities Eye Consultants, has proudly served the Twin Cities for more than 55 years now, in 7 convenient locations. Using the most advanced technology combined with human touch, Edina Eye offers comprehensive services and dedicated specialists committed to excellence, with innovative procedures and expertise for the most advanced eye care.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Access to Democracy. I'm your guest host today, Steve Francisco, and I'm pleased to welcome back to our studio a returning guest who we've had several times in the past. Professor David Schultz is a professor of political science at Hamline University and also teaches at the University of Minnesota Law School, my alma mater,
Right.
and teaches constitutional law and is a recognized national expert on election law. Did I just about get that right?
You got it close enough, and that's good, and it's great to be here.
Good to have you with us again, David. So let's jump right into it because I have a lot of things we'd like to talk to you about today.
Good.
A lot of activity at the U.S. Supreme Court recently dealing with the subject of abortion rights.
Right.
The state of Texas legislature passed a bill this summer known as Senate Bill 8, which significantly restricts the right to abortion, basically prohibits abortions after, I believe it was 16 weeks of pregnancy.
6.
Or, I'm sorry, 6
6
weeks. 6
yes.
weeks of pregnancy. Yes. And also, a really novel thing in this Texas law, it basically says that anyone can sue an abortion provider or anybody who provides any assistance in obtaining an abortion, so the doctors, the nurses, even the person who drove them to the clinic, theoretically, to get an abortion procedure. Isn't this a problem with the way the law should work? Because traditionally, we've had this case known as Roe versus Wade, which has been established American law since 1973. And basically, what they've done in Texas, it seems like they're trying to do an end run around how we do about protecting a woman's constitutional right to abortion.
Yeah, there's several problems with the Texas law, but I want to step back just and say a couple things about what Roe is about. Roe, as you described it here, 1973 case, reaffirmed in 1992 by a conservative Supreme Court, an opinion with Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy. And the basic point of Roe is to say that women have a right to terminate their pregnancy, almost an unlimited right, up to approximately 24 weeks. And that's been really ensconced in the law. And of course we know there's been many religious conservatives, and the Republican Party has taken a position they wanted to overturn Roe. Justices have been appointed by Republican presidents, including Donald Trump, George Bush, Ronald Reagan.
Trump got three justices on the court in the space of 4 years.
Exactly, a near record. And they all want to overturn Roe. They all want to basically say that a basic fundamental right regarding how a woman uses her body, I'm going to say how she conducts her life, is not protected under the Constitution. The Texas law, and there's also one from Mississippi, Texas would say no right after 6 weeks, Mississippi would say no right after 15 weeks, are a direct assault on Roe. And these states have passed these laws knowing that there's now a conservative court of at least 5-4, if not 6-3, that has expressed a disagreement with Roe versus Wade. If the court were to overturn Roe, and it's pretty likely that it looks like they're going to overturn Roe, first off, this is relatively rare. I got a book coming out. It wasn't my point to do a promo for my book.
That's all right.
Yeah, but in the entire history of the U.S. Supreme Court, the Supreme Court has only overturned one of its constitutional precedents 145 times out of almost 10,500 opinions. We're looking at an incredibly small number. So this could be one of those cases. And if it does, it sends it back, we think, to the states to decide what they want to do on abortion, which means you could have a crazy quilt pattern across the country. Some states will protect abortion rights, some don't. Some will criminalize it. It'll be all over the place.
And I thought the point of a Supreme Court decision is that we don't subject what are determined to be constitutional rights. We don't subject those to annual votes in state legislatures, popular votes to determine whether or not people have that right or not.
You're absolutely...
Didn't we fight a civil war to determine this issue about who's going to decide what the law is, what's constitutional under the federal Constitution?
You're absolutely correct. Were it to overturn Roe versus Wade, this would be the only case in American history, legal history, where the Supreme Court has reversed itself to provide less protection for rights. Now, one of my favorite quotes, Justice Robert Jackson was on the Supreme Court back in the 1940s, and there's a famous case, West Virginia versus Barnett. And in the hysteria of World War II, we passed laws mandating the Pledge of Allegiance.
Yep.
And it was a case that struck down the mandatory Pledge of Allegiance law because it forced Jehovah's Witnesses to actually do this against their religious beliefs. And Robert Jackson's great line, you almost paraphrased here, he said that the protection of rights should not depend upon election returns.
Very good.
And it's exactly what's happening here. I mean, think about, I mentioned the case in 1992, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, when the Supreme Court affirmed Roe. What the court said back then was smart. It said, remember, this is roughly 20 years after Roe, it said an entire generation of women have come of age with the reliance and belief they have a right to conduct themselves, to control their reproductive rights. That argument should be even stronger 30 years later.
You would think so.
You would think
when
so.
I was in law school, and I'm sure you've taught this in classes you have taught too, there's a principle in law that we learned early on. It's a Latin phrase called stare decisis. It means, basically, if I'm phrasing it correctly, stand by things that are decided.
Yes.
And it is this important principle in law about respect for precedent. Now, that doesn't mean courts can't ever turn around and say, you know, we were wrong. They did that most famously in Brown versus Board of Education, which reversed Plessy versus Ferguson, that said separate but equal racial accommodations was constitutional. So there are times, but they're very rare, when the court takes a constitutional issue and turns around and says, we made a mistake. But what is the impact of this, what is happening right now, where the Supreme Court has thus far punted and refused to take the Texas law and to overturn it? And not only that, they heard a case from Mississippi on the Mississippi statute. They heard oral argument on December 1st. I want to get your reaction to this, a very short quote.
Right.
Justice Sonia Sotomayor, during the oral arguments, this caught my ear. Will this institution, talking about the court, survive the stench that this creates in the public perception that the Constitution and its reading are just political acts? Do you share her concern?
I do very much. We knew even before this term started that according to public opinion polls, the respect for the Supreme Court is taking a nosedive at this point. And what Sotomayor was responding to was that concern. By the way, beyond her, even before the oral arguments, 5 different justices on the court have all responded to criticisms that they're effectively turned into what? No more than politicians wearing robes, that they're not ruling on the law, they're ruling on their partisan preferences. And I think this is what the Sotomayor was hitting at here, is that were we to do this, this looks purely political. And again, I also want to underscore, is that when it has reversed decisions, such as in Brown versus the Board of Education, or another case, Lawrence v. Texas, reversing itself on a case that one time said that it's okay to criminalize sexual relations between same-sex couples. When it usually reverses its opinions, it does so to protect rights, not to restrict them. And this is going to be a case where they're going to do it and restrict rights.
Right.
And this is going to be a major problem because what? Women are not going to have a guarantee regarding what their reproductive lives.
That's right. Very interesting. Let's transition a little bit from the Supreme Court to talk about another issue affecting our democracy, and that is the state of voting rights in America. We have seen an onslaught of efforts in a number of states, and I would say particularly in southern states, but a number of others too, that basically are doing everything they can to restrict access to the right to vote. We're talking about reducing the number of polling places. We're talking about curtailing absentee voting, curtailing the hours that people can vote. And many of these efforts, they seem designed to particularly hit hard at communities of color or minority populations. It also gets into the gerrymandering issue. We'll talk about that in a moment. But just a question for you right now. These efforts to restrict voting rights, how big a threat are these activities in state legislatures to our democracy?
They are an enormous threat. The Brennan Center out of New York has documented way in excess of 400 laws across 42 states aimed mostly at restricting the right to vote. What we're really in the middle of right now is what I call the second great disenfranchisement in American history. I don't mean great by being good, but the first great disenfranchisement occurred when Reconstruction ended in 1877, and we basically ushered in an era that made it impossible across the South for African Americans to vote. We are now in the middle of that.
Many of whom were newly freed slaves.
Exactly.
With the constitutional amendments, 14th Amendment, the amendment to ban slavery, and bringing African Americans into full citizenship.
Right, and you're absolutely correct. And in the 1960s, we passed the Voting Rights Act that further empowered people of color to be able to vote. But what's happened is that we have a partisan divide now, a partisan divide between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans want to restrict the right to vote, and in Republican legislatures across the country, they're trying to do that. But it's not just there. It is when, at the same time in Congress, where Congress is trying to pass legislation to overturn Supreme Court decisions that made it harder to vote, Congress is deadlocked. The Supreme Court has walked away from supporting the Voting Rights Act.
A few years ago, Justice Ginsburg took note when the Supreme Court, she dissented from a decision that basically nullified a key section of the Voting Rights Act having to do with monitoring of states that had a history of discriminating against voters. And when the court threw out that provision of the Voting Rights Act, she basically predicted what we are seeing right now.
She's absolutely correct. And a little bit of trivia, I guess, legal trivia here. In the entire history of the United States, the only time voting rights are protected or expanded is when the federal government steps in. Constitutional amendment, Voting Rights Acts. If a president sends in some support, the Justice Department prosecutes, the Supreme Court issues an opinion. That's when it happens. And what's happened now is that the federal government, through the Supreme Court and through states taking over, has walked away from protecting voting rights.
So-called states' rights versus a concept of federalism.
Exactly, exactly. And voting rights are only protected when they're federalized. And what we're seeing here, and this is exactly why this connects to abortion, is when the federal government exits, when states are generally left to themselves, rights generally don't win.
Wow. Let's talk about another threat to our democracy that we see happening right now, and talking about the issue of gerrymandering. We just had the 2020 census done last year. The Constitution requires that we take a numerical count of all the people in America, or as many of them as we can reach, and that was done last year in the midst of a pandemic. But as a result of the census count, now state legislatures are busy reallocating political power through the drawing of congressional districts and the drawing of state legislative districts. And what we're seeing is what has always been a political process seems to have gone into hyper overdrive, if you will, in terms of how politics is affecting how these legislative districts are drawn. Say something about that.
Sure. The theme for today's show seems to be when the feds get out of the game, what happens, what goes wrong. And what's happening is that for many years we had states gerrymandering on their own, racially or not adhering to one person, one vote. Supreme Court stepped in and said you can't do that. Back in the 80s, the Supreme Court said you can't screw around with lines based on partisan affiliation, called partisan gerrymandering. About 2 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court said, we're not going to hear cases about partisan gerrymandering. That's up to the states to deal with. Now, a couple of states like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, under their own courts have stepped in. But guess what's happened now is that in states that are partisanly being controlled, especially by Republicans, in Wisconsin's a great example right across the border from us here. They're drawing the lines in the way to what? To further entrench themselves and to make it difficult for the people to have their say. And so what's happening now is we're seeing across the country this effort at partisan gerrymandering to rig the election, to basically what? The Republicans lost fair and square across the country in 2020, and in many of those states, we know they're upset, they're angry. Trump has cried foul.
Or if they didn't lose them, they came closer than they wanted to.
Exactly. And Trump and the Republicans now are saying, we don't want this to happen again.
Right.
We want to basically what? Change the rules of the game. And that's what's happening with voting rights laws and with gerrymandering, is to basically insulate Republican majorities in office at least for another decade.
Insulate or enhance them.
Right.
And let's go back to what we were talking, because this relates to the issues about voting rights reform, gerrymandering, and the protection of individual rights. You know, much of this seems to have been premised on the big lie, I call it, coming from this election, where the president challenged this election and said that it was rampant fraud, that he lost because of fraud. Let's be very clear, that was not supported, and when he said, well, this needs to be looked at, well, it was. Over 60 courts,
right.
Federal and state courts, including by judges appointed by President Trump, looked at what his lawyers presented and said, basically, you have no case. And yet Republicans in state legislatures are often running with this as a basis for changing voting laws in a way that makes it much tougher for people to vote.
You're absolutely correct. It was like 62 or 63 cases when they had the opportunity, show us the evidence,
Right.
show us the information. They could not do it. On top of which now, Rudy Giuliani, one of his attorneys, has also now been sanctioned in the state of New York for what? Lawyers are not allowed to bring frivolous cases they know that have no merit. And they basically said to him, guess what? You lied. You lied to the public. You lied to the court. You brought a frivolous case. The point being is that, I like to tell people this story here, you have a better chance of buying a Powerball ticket and winning than you do in showing that voter fraud is a problem in the United States. And I'm not just making that up. There was the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism several years ago. I worked with them, and we tabulated up all the instances of where we could document and prove voter fraud and look at the odds. It actually panned out. Buy your Powerball ticket, you've got a better chance on that. And so despite all that, the big fraud, the big lie.
It's interesting that in at least one race that I can think of, the Georgia U.S. Senate election, one could make the argument that actually this argument about rampant fraud suppressed the vote on the Republican side, because Republicans said, say Trump says that our votes aren't being counted correctly, we're going to stay home. They stayed home, and the two Democrats, Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, won the U.S. Senate seats in the state of Georgia.
By very close margins.
Close margins, but they won nonetheless.
They're right.
So,
Georgia is also interesting because what? As we speak, Trump is still being investigated in Georgia for possible criminal charges, because remember, he pressured and tried to tell the election official there to say, can you come up with 12,000 votes?
all I need is 12,000
That's right.
votes. Yeah.
So in fact, if there's any fraud out there, or attempted fraud, it was brought by what? Or by whom? By Trump himself.
Let's talk about another issue here too, and this is sort of it. Probably people's eyes will glaze over when you mention the word filibuster.
Yes.
But just to say really quickly what it is, the filibuster is a procedure in the U.S. Senate where on controversial measures, it basically requires a supermajority. They have to have 60 votes to move forward to pass a piece of legislation if somebody threatens to filibuster. And there is a real push right now to reform the filibuster or to abolish it. Our two U.S. senators have come out for abolishing it, I believe. Amy Klobuchar and Tina Smith have both said
Correct.
This is an anti-democratic procedural device that is basically preventing the passage of important legislation in the U.S. Senate, like the infrastructure bill previously and the president's legislation he's trying to get through to stimulate the economy, like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act
Right.
and other things. Say something about the filibuster. What are your thoughts on this? Is it anti-democratic? Should the Senate get rid of this? And also, what happens if the Republicans take the majority back in the U.S. Senate? What are the implications of abolishing the filibuster?
Sure. One has to always weigh pluses and minuses. I would argue at the end of the day, you have to get rid of the filibuster rule. Okay. Historically, it was used by the slave states pre-Civil War to defend and protect them. It's been more often than not been used to what? Prevent civil rights legislation from being able to be enacted. It has been a tool to allow what? One senator. All it takes is one senator to say, I don't want something to go forward, and they can prevent that legislation from occurring unless you get 60 senators to vote in favor of it. Now, that's so anti-democratic in the sense, if we think of democracy being something approaching majority rule, yes, majority rule and protection of minority rights, I think is the broader notion of it, of democracy. But here, historically, filibuster has been used as a tool to prevent legislation from passing. Now, I know there are some people who will argue and say, well, the threat of a filibuster, what that does is what? Forces compromise. The evidence does not support that. Instead, what we find out is what the filibuster rule does is to give what? Somebody a veto. It's what? My way or highway. It is, and think about what's happening with Joe Manchin right now. Joe Manchin is singularly able to stop the movement of legislation that deals with voting rights, that deals with Build Back Better, and a whole bunch of other things. And it's not
he's singularly able to do that because the Democrat, it's 50-49,
That's
and
right.
the Democrats have to hold every Democrat plus have the vice president cast a tie-breaking vote.
You're absolutely correct.
Right.
It's a little bit different than the filibuster, but my point is still the same,
Yeah.
is that one person with the filibuster rule, unless you get the 60 votes, can basically stop the political process from operating.
Yeah.
And if we think of the idea of saying that what? A minority, I'm not talking about a person of color, we talk about a numerical minority can basically say as one person, we're going to stop deliberations and prevent the political process from acting. That is the essence of what it means to be anti-democratic.
Mm-hmm. So let's move on to a subject that has been in the news quite a bit lately, and it is the subject of police reform and public safety. And, you know, we're discussing this at a time when we're in the aftermath of the verdict in the George Floyd case, the horrific murder of a citizen on the street in Minneapolis, where Derek Chauvin was convicted and is now sentenced to 22 years in prison. But there have been a number of cases all across the country where there have been challenges to bad policing and police misconduct. This is also happening in the context of a period where we're seeing a rapid surge in violent crimes in Minnesota and across the country, a rash of carjackings, a rash of so-called smash and grab crimes in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities suburbs, across the country, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, LA. Minneapolis had a question on the ballot last in November, which had to do with amending the charter to create a Department of Public Safety, which may or may not have included a police department. And so some people came to say, well, they're talking about abolishing the police. What's the path forward on the subject of police reform? How do we get to a place where we have good police officers, respect for the role of law enforcement, and protecting public safety?
This is a tough question here. And I think in part what happened in Minneapolis was bad framing of the issue. Very early on, 9 council members after George Floyd was murdered said abolish the police, defund the police. And even though later on they backed away, some of them backed away from it, that message, that moniker was firmly ensconced in the voters' mind. And when proponents of what was ballot Proposition 2 in Minneapolis couldn't articulate exactly what their alternative vision was, people's fear kicked in. Fear of violent crime, fear of personal safety. And that fear is almost primordial, and it makes it hard to bring about reform. In the same way that fear of crime has always made it difficult to reform, let's say, criminal, drug laws, et cetera, et cetera. So the path forward, I think, at this point, and what I think the voters were saying is that we want better policing, but we still want policing. We still need police for personal and public safety. So now the issue is, how do you articulate it in a different language? The idea of saying we still need to address racial disparities in policing, the use of excessive force in disproportionate numbers against people of color, and even against just everybody in general.
Well, and how about the issue too, and this came into this debate about public safety, that is it really appropriate to have the police responding to calls necessarily where you have mental health issues? Now, it could be the case that the person is armed, and obviously you have to have police play a role there. But we've had a lot of encounters between citizens and police where the person involved had mental health issues. And so shouldn't there be a push to try to include mental health professionals working with the police in some of these circumstances, and also to de-escalate situations so they don't end in things going horribly awry and citizens' deaths unnecessarily?
Former police chief, Minneapolis Police Chief Arredondo, in the closing days said, there's nothing that prevents us from doing that. It's a great idea. We ought to have more MSWs, more social workers. We ought to do a better job in training police officers how to de-escalate and recognize problems. That's part of the broader picture we need to be thinking about with police reform.
And this being said too, we do have to acknowledge our police do a very difficult job. I've interviewed the Eagan police chief. I know police officers here. I have police officers in my family too. They do a very difficult job, but we give police officers a tremendous power. Literally, the power of life and death is in their hands. In their encounters with people, we want them trained well, and we want them to be held accountable too.
I think that's the message of what we learned from the George Floyd's death and the Derek Chauvin trial. Exactly.
And in the case of Mr. Chauvin, he's pleaded guilty this week in federal court to civil rights violations with Mr. Floyd, and also a 17-year-old who he had apparently abused previously. So, there are certain people who simply should not be carrying a badge and a gun.
You're right, and I think the path forward is again, how do we separate out the good versus the bad cops, and how do we provide the training so that police officers can do their job in the way they're supposed to?
Right. Well, we've been very interested in talking with our good friend, Professor David Schultz from Hamline University and the University of Minnesota Law School, a great institution which we both graduated from. And David, I hope you'll come back and see us again on Access to Democracy in the near future. We have a lot more to talk about.
I will. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us.
Of course.